When are we going to say enough is enough instead of sitting back and say they'll fix it? Well, they broke it. Why? They don't have any intention to fix it, right? So I think there are a lot of questions we have to answer as a housing movement here in the U.S. We just need a home. Well, you don't have a home because of this economic system that we live under, and you have to understand how it operates, right? And you have to understand the role of workers in society. The more I talk about the role of workers in society and how you are making the 1% wealthier and your accumulation of stuff, for lack of a better way to say it, is really working against you. And I think now folks are starting to wake up to these issues in a way that I hadn't seen them wake up to in years.
In the United States, even more strongly than in other places, it's the war against the poor and the criminalization of poverty. Right now, we are living in escalation of this war. The new administrative order called Ending Crime and Disorder of American Streets of July 2025 is meant to punish those who do not have enough money to afford rent. As the Southern Poverty Law Center Deputy Legal Director for Economic Justice, Kirsten Anderson, stated, the Supreme Court held that it is a crime to be homeless at a moment in which housing is unaffordable for half the people in the country, proving that it continues to be out of touch with the American public. This is the theme of today, is the relation between capitalism and poverty and homelessness, and how out of touch the dominant narrative is, backed by economic models that are themselves out of touch. We are here today to discuss these issues with Rob Robinson, a very special guest. Rob teaches at the New School and at the City College of New York City, where he just recently received an honorary doctorate. Rob was homeless for over 2 years after he lost his job in 2021, lived in the streets of Miami, and then in the shelters of New York City. Rob is someone who's since then been at the forefront of the housing movement and struggle, not only in the United States and in New York, but globally, in touch with the homeless populations and their movements in Hungary, Germany, South Africa, and Brazil. Before we get into our discussion, I would like to start with a more systemic question, which is, what is the relationship between our capitalist economy and poverty and homelessness more broadly?
So homelessness is a direct result of poverty in America. The numbers have increased as long as wages continue to stay stagnant and the price of housing goes up. We're going to see people at risk of homelessness. But it's been exacerbated by the way capitalism plays out in different economies, particularly in New York City. So to handle this issue, New York City spends about $3 billion a year to temporarily house people in shelters. It's not a long-term solution, it's a short-term solution, but they give this work to not-for-profit organizations. So even though they're not-for-profit organizations, they don't want it to go away because they're receiving massive amounts of money from the city. And I think that carries out at other places around the country. Not to the degree that it does in New York City, but we see a direct relationship. Also, the fact that the only jobs available in this country are service industry jobs that don't pay a living wage. People are always at risk of homelessness. So it's a system that is oppressing already oppressed people.
Rob, let's bring the conversation up to the present moment. We know that 1 out of 2 full-time American workers cannot afford their basic needs, including housing. Let's look at the deeper roots of the problem. Given that the current situation is one that tends to instead point the finger to the individual rather than to the system. We're going to listen to our conversation of a couple months ago and then get back with the most important questions about the current situation and also the current hopes, especially in New York, with the electoral campaign of Zoran Mandami.
I think that what we need to do, there are a few things we need to do in terms of allowing the private market to play a more significant role in the construction of additional housing supply. That includes ending the requirement to build parking lots when we're constructing housing. That means increasing density around mass transit hubs. That means upzoning wealthier neighborhoods that have historically not contributed to housing production. What makes our campaign distinct is in tandem with that. I also believe that the public sector has a role to play in building immediately affordable housing.
We would like to begin discussing with you the numbers, the statistics. Indeed, part of the fetishism for economics derives from the fact that apparently economists are the only ones who can master numbers, relying on statistics as hard data that is ultimately objective and indisputable. Now, what we see is that clearly statistics are quite interpretative, and often, especially when it is about tracking failures of our capitalist economy, they tend to underestimate the actual historical issues. And this is, I guess, really emblematic in the case of homelessness, as one of the, I would say, most obvious signs of the decadence of our capitalist economy. In the United States, we have a number that is over 771,000 homeless people for 2024. But this is a gross undercount. Can you tell us a little bit about these statistics and why one has to be very critical about them and wary of where they come from and how they are collected?
First, Clara, thank you for inviting me to this conversation. I'm one that a community member, and generally we always thought of, particularly underserved communities, always thought of data collection as security. But I'm a believer data can be used for or against your argument, right? So we need to adapt the fact that if that's what the power brokers are interpreting, then we have to make sure we get it out there to tell our story. So I think with that number, the 771,000 is a total undercount. And what do I mean by that? So our federal government uses a formula that says on the last week of January every year or the first week of February, we're going to go out, we're going to organize people to go out through communities across the U.S. to go out and count people between 12 midnight and 4 a.m. in the morning. Right? Whoever's on the street is truly homeless, right? So we try to interview these people by having conversations with them. I make the argument, always have made the argument, that if you are a person who's homeless, particularly where I come from in New York, where the weather is brutal, the last week in January or the first week in February, you're not going to be out on the street. You're going to find some place that's warm. You know, people who are homeless are resilient. People who sleep rough, live out on the streets, figure out ways to take care of themselves. So they're not going to be very visible. So your count is flawed. It's flawed from the very time it's done. So that for those 4 hours, it's not a count that's real. And it doesn't count people that are what I like to call the hidden homeless. When you talk about people doubled up, families doubled up, people finding other places to go that just, out of sight and out of mind. So the number is flawed. And I think as you go, it can be done in different parts of the city, right? Based on geographic regions. So it might work the last Monday in January in Miami because it's warm, but it doesn't work in New York. I've always made the argument, you want a true count in New York, do a second count the last Monday in July when people are visible, they surface, they're up in parks, they're visible in the subways. So it's a flawed calculation, I think, from its very creation.
So would it be correct to say that experts estimate that it could be even 3 times as high?
I think we've always used that number in New York City as a social justice movement, as a housing movement, as a homeless and housing movement in New York. We've always said that number has to be tripled when you figure out the number in New York City. So whatever number is attributed by Housing and Urban Development, you'll hear me say HUD, probably throughout this conversation, that's Housing and Urban Development, that the calculation that they use is not a true reflection of what is happening, right? And so it's always going to be flawed, and you'll always get exceptions to the rule. And in New York City, we've always said it's triple that number at the very least.
Yeah, and I think ultimately the New York City Board of Education gets a bit closer to the reality because they calculate that actually in New York City, there are over 144,000 children in public schools who have actually experienced homelessness in 2024. And this is actually the 10th year in which the number is increasing every year. So I guess here the point is that homelessness cannot be attributed, as is still in a way in our legitimizing rhetoric, to the misbehavior of
That's right.
citizens who do not know how to fit in. If children, families are in these conditions, the problem is much more structural.
Absolutely. We've always sidestepped that issue, right? This is a structural problem, and this is a structural problem that has existed since our government started disinvesting in housing, right? For years, public housing was a true social safety net for people in this country. And that's where people who were slipping through the cracks through no fault of their own, mostly economic reasons, right? And I'll pinpoint those economic reasons by saying wages not rising as fast as the cost of housing, right? So it puts people behind the eight ball. That's the fundamental issue that drives homelessness and a lack of housing and poverty, right? We've never addressed poverty in this country. You know, if you do your homework, you know that Malcolm X and Martin Luther King both took bullets to end their life because they were going to the UN to address poverty in this country. So those are the driving forces that create homelessness. But we've gone out of our way in this country to blame the individual. It's your fault. You failed. Anybody can make it in this country. And that is so untrue. And I speak from my own thought process and my own lived experience. It's always been looked at, as you heard my resume, you heard that I was homeless for 2.5 years on the streets of Miami, 10 months in a New York City homeless shelter. But as I got out of homelessness, I started hearing rhetoric and that prevailing narrative of you're homeless because you don't want to work. You're homeless because you don't have an education. You're homeless because you have a chemical or an alcohol addiction. You're homeless because you have mental illness. Well, for me, I started working with my dad in the restaurant business when I was 9 years old. So I'm not lazy. I have an undergraduate degree from the University of Maryland, have an education, never diagnosed with a chemical or alcohol addiction. And that's no reason for us to discard humanity. And the same thing for anybody diagnosed with mental illness. We should show humanity and care and show some mutual aid to help those folks. So those narratives bothered me and always bothered me. And it's what pushed me into this work to try to figure out how do we get around this and how do we push back on these narratives? And there are ways to push back, right? There's now a model of policy that's floating around the world that we basically almost refuse to adapt wholeheartedly in the US, and that's a housing first policy. Housing first means somebody who's suffering from a lack of housing should be given a home and then bring any support services that they need. But instead, the approach that we've taken in the US, we got to fix you first, right? You're broken. So if we fix you, then we can supply you with some housing, right? And I think that's just such a wrong approach.
Fascinating, Rob. So we started off with a critique of statistics and how, of course, the way you collect data matters and how often instead economists tend to use numbers without paying attention as to how the very collection can have biases, especially in downplaying structural issues. And then the other limit that we just brought up is about the explanation. So not only about how the information, the raw information, but also how then do we explain that information. And the explanation is, I think, where really a heterodox approach can be fundamental in economics because it points exactly to the systemic rather than pointing to individual behavior, which has been the focus of neoclassical economics, that then has as an assumption that all the burden lies on the behavior of the individual. We know that issues are much larger. And I guess the very basic point that is intuitive but is not stressed enough is how ultimately The issue here is that housing has become a commodity, and as such, it does not reflect the logic of satisfying the need of shelter, but the logic of capital accumulation and profit making. And ultimately, how this fact that can be tampered with public interventions that ultimately try to decommodify housing has seen a big limit especially in recent years, in which actually housing has become one of the primary ways to speculate and ultimately invest into predatory speculation, and especially the best place to invest of big private equity funds. So how is it that we can see this in New York, and what can you do to push back against these this ultimately double trend, which is the dismantling of the social resources from the part of governments, both local and federal? So the incapacity to actually have a vision for public housing that is sustainable, connected with the fact that then this becomes really a space to plunder and thus basically to speculate on housing, and then which brings to an enormous amount of evictions, connected to what you just said, which is of course that wages are too low to even be able to keep up with moderate increases in rentals.
So I think the approach that the housing movements, particularly in New York City, have taken have been multi-pronged. I'll start out with using the human rights framework, meeting people's needs. Everybody needs a home. A home is a place of stability, and it stabilizes your life. So while maybe 10, 15 years ago, housing as a human right was a slogan, people are understanding now what it means to meet people's needs. At the same time, they understand the commodification of this particular thing called housing and how that works against meeting the human right to a home. Right? And we have a real contradiction in New York, because we have a right to shelter, right? So it means that on any given night, that the government has an obligation, if you go to the city, to house you in a shelter. It's not a home, right? It's missing all cultural adequacy. It's not meeting your needs in general, right? So we know shelter is a problem, but that shelter industrial complex is expanded to the tune of 600 shelters in New York City. So it's a place basically to warehouse bodies, in my opinion. And I think the fact that New York City sort of farms out this work to not-for-profit organizations, even though they're called quote-unquote not-for-profit organizations, they don't seem to want that money to go away. So when somebody comes along like myself who speaks out against it, you often hear many of these providers, well, Rob, you have a voice, the press, the media comes up to you. Why are you speaking out against shelter? You spent 10 months in a shelter. I said, absolutely. I spent those 10 months and I realized that this is a problem. And how do we undo this shelter industrial complex? So that's how I think outside of the box. I think it's a problem. And I always defend my position with saying, you'll never hear me say we don't need social workers. We just need them in a different setting. The setting that you all have created has been a profit box. But then the other problem is the commodification of housing and how difficult it is to get a hold of. So we call the housing that's being built in New York that sits empty for speculation, we call it the new safe deposit box, right? So you have speculators from outside of the country investing in New York City, right? Investing in these properties, waiting for their profit margin to reach 20%, and then they offload it to somebody. They want to make 20% return on their money. Can't get that from a bank. You can't get that from anywhere else. But you can get it in the real estate market. So how do you want to do that? You have to just rethink your relationship to land and housing. And that takes me back to the work I was involved with Take Back the Land. We knew fundamentally we were going to have a problem if we didn't change that fundamental relationship. And and housing as a commodity will not work for a big section of society. So how do you do it? Well, you start to invest in things like community land trusts, removing land from the speculative market, putting it in land banks, finding creative ways to communally own and govern land. It's a different way of thinking in this country. But you're up against a force. You're up against private equity. You're up against developers who invest a lot of money, invest in politicians to see it their way. So it's challenges. Not easy work to do, but the organizing is happening in these communities now. And I would hope, I think we're still short on popular and political education, because you can go into a community that is being oppressed by these issues and talk about capitalism. And often I'm met with, you're bringing those heady subjects into the community, Rob. You know, we just need a home. Well, you don't have a home because of this economic system that we live under, and you have to understand how it operates, right? And you have to understand the role of workers in society. That's where I think people are waking up. The more I talk about the role of workers in society and how you are making the 1% wealthier, and your accumulation of stuff, for lack of a better way to say it, is really working against you. And I think now folks are starting to wake up to these issues in a way that I hadn't seen them wake up to in years. So.
Yeah, it's this is another problem that often appears in mainstream economics, is the compartmentalization of issues. This is not just a problem of the market of the housing market. It's a problem of the relations of production.
That's
and
right.
we see actually that the experts tell us that over half of the homeless population in the United States works. The point is, what type of work are we talking about? Not only is it work that ultimately is dependent on the employer, on what is being produced and how much you get to keep in your paycheck, it's also work that is constantly made by a design more precarious.
That's right. That's
so actually, I walked into a Dollar Tree just the other week, and I spoke to the cashier to show her the flyer, and she looked at me and she said, well, you know, I know more homeless people than non-homeless people, and I'm homeless myself because I'm making $11 an hour as a night manager, and I can only work up to 19 hours a week. To keep, you know, and she didn't tell me the reason, but clearly the reason is so that she can be off benefits as a part-time worker. So the connection between the housing struggle with the general struggle for like changing really how we approach the very production of resources is key. So did you see this happening also in the other countries you participated in? How different were these different movements in different parts of the world?
I don't think it was too much different. And I think in some instances they're way ahead of us because they understood it better. They were willing to engage in the popular and political education to understand this economic system that we live under and push back on it. So I was always fascinated, particularly in places like Barcelona. And, you know, when I go to Brazil and working with the social movements down there, I've been at the MST school in Sao Paulo numerous times. I've taken that 6-week course. And part of the underpinning of that education there is all about the economic system and how it negatively affects us. So I think outside of the U.S., there is more knowledge on how the economic system negatively affects our lives. But I think we are learning here because what happens is what is working against us are transnational corporations, right? So you can have a corporation that might be based in the U.S., but affecting these social movements around the world. And the biggest example of that is a housing movement called a housing group called Blackstone, private equity firm, which is probably the largest owner of housing in the world. And you have groups in Spain that are pushing back against this group. And as far back as 2013, they were coming to the U.S. to say, we need you all to help us because we're fighting against this big conglomerate that has its main offices on Park Avenue in New York City. So we need you to stand side by side to protest with us. And I think things like that start to bubble up and people start to understand it a little bit better. And are starting to engage in the popular and political education as necessary in the U.S. in an ongoing basis to learn from these other movements. However, I want to be real. I still think there's some pushback when it comes to internationalism. I often, as an organizer, I feel alone many times by coming back from Barcelona, coming back from Sao Paulo, Brazil, or coming back from Berlin, Germany, and talking about what I witnessed over there and how I went. And I would get a reaction, yeah, that's great, Rob. I know, you know, they do it different over there. And there's almost, an exceptionalism that can, I don't know any other way to explain. I think it's an exceptionalism as if we do everything better here. And I'm not a believer in that. You know, I've witnessed firsthand the changes. I've stood on the streets of Barcelona when a family was about to be evicted. And 150 people show up, including yours truly, 3 years ago, Thanksgiving week. And I watched La Paz negotiate with the lawyers on the street, and that family get to stay in their apartment, right? It was a radical move, but they realized the community is engaged in the struggle. The community is going to defend this family. And they have some international folks who are witnessing what's going on here. And it just changes the landscape when you collaborate and you come together like that.
Yeah, and it's fascinating because the housing right is really a right that can unite workers from very different sectors that are usually very, very divided and potentially don't see how they are actually participating in very similar struggles because they share fundamental needs that this economic system is not really able to grant them because it's not meant to grant them. Again, it's not about the system failing in general. It's working for the objective it's supposed to work for, which
That's
is
right.
enrich the richest
That's
and
right.
the speculators, but it's not working to satisfy needs.
That's right.
It's very important that we don't think that if the economy goes well, these problems will be solved
There you
automatically,
go.
because again, our economy is never really meant to satisfy these needs for people. So the fact that people can come together in these struggles is interesting. And also how is it that ultimately participating in these struggles by pressuring for the right to housing allows you also to maybe become more creative about what housing should look like in the first place, and how to actually take back spaces of communal existence that are indeed insulated from the capitalist dynamics that ultimately dehumanize a lot of us, even if we are amongst those who, are not suffering the most.
I think a big part of it for me and my understanding is I start with constitutions and progressive and non-progressive constitutions. So we have a constitution in this country written 250 years ago. It's written in a certain language. It starts out with the line, "We the people." And I repeatedly asked as I lecture at law schools, who were those people? Because people that looked like me were considered 3/5 of a man. We weren't even a human, right? Women didn't count. So it served the needs of a select few. But then when I take a closer look at newer constitutions, post-dictatorship Brazil, 1985, a constitution that says land has to serve a social purpose or function, growing food or housing people. Wow, what a difference, right? The Constitution of South Africa, written post-apartheid 1996, says housing is a human right. In their constitution, it's language in their constitution. You may not always actualize it, but you have a fight because it's written in black and white. So you have groups going into constitutional court and winning, right? The equivalent of our Supreme Court. I make the argument that we have a constitution, 250 years old, written in a certain language that houses our civil law. So if our civil law is framed by a constitution that's flawed, then our civil law is flawed. So I'd rather believe in international human rights law, which gives you reasons why housing is a human right, and the arguments that we can make on behalf of housing as a human right, versus the commodification of housing and if you don't have the money or you can't afford to pay, you can't have. That's problematic. And I think until we start to educate ourselves and embrace international human rights law instead of calling ourselves this great democracy and separating ourselves from that, we're going to have problems. So I think we have to go a long way to educating people around this issue. Now, that's also a challenge because people can get insulted when you say you want to educate them. But I make the argument after coming out of homelessness, I got transformed and I had to re-educate myself because there were certain values and things that were instilled in me the first half of my life that didn't play out the right way the second half. And I said, time to do a brain dump, learn the world all over again. So, part of it, and I'll always make this argument, is on the individual. Right? I don't want to cast aspersions on anybody. that they should go through what I went through, 2.5 years on the streets of Miami, 10 months in a homeless shelter, to become transformed. But oh boy, what a difference when you become transformed and you see the world through a different lens, right? And the lens that doesn't work for you is pushed to the side, and you see this clear lens called the right to housing, and just the so-called democracy of the U.S. is not really a democracy, that it was drilled into your head in the first part of your life.
So I guess the point is also realizing very realistically how, this law is very abstract and doesn't hold. And, the current massacres in Gaza very much show how international law has no space. It is all about economic forces, ultimately violent forces. So the point is, how do we actually struggle concretely to make our rights respected? And in this sense, how is it that your experience as a homeless person has informed the concrete struggles that ultimately also propose solutions? Sure, you can, of course, use the law in your favor to try to win some legal action, but that's definitely not sufficient, right? You need also a capacity to imagine a different way of thinking about housing. So how is it, A, that your experience has helped you understand what is actually a much more holistic way of understanding the organizational processes? And also, how are these organizational processes giving concrete solutions that go beyond the increasing the supply of houses in the private market that is the best one for governments to basically...
So I think it's going to be a multifaceted approach. I'm a big believer in utilizing vacant space. And by that I mean the idea of take back the land was, and let me just frame that work was done as a response to the foreclosure crisis of 2008. The Obama administration took our tax money to bail out banks. Banks then in turn started foreclosing and evicting us in record numbers, especially in Black and Latino neighborhoods. And once they evict us, they got the house back. And in many instances, many states, we had to buy an insurance policy from the federal government to ensure that we're going to pay off that mortgage. So the banks are profiting, and then they have our house to put back on the market. So we said, no. You can't have the money in the houses too. So we're going to take back the houses and start to move the families back in there who were evicted and use international human rights law to guarantee their right to be in there. You're taking risks, but you have to take risks to make social change, right? But how do you organize your communities to rise up and need to take risks? And that's where I think we come up short in the U.S. I still hold a grudge, and I'll say it openly on this recording, that we didn't rise up in this country in 2008. Our response should have been to take it to the streets. We should have just overwhelmed our government and said, we're taking our houses back, right? Send a strong message to the government. This ain't going to work. You're not going to do this. You're not going to get away with it. But instead, I'm afraid, especially in the African-American community, we saw the first Black president as a martyr, right? We can't do anything to work against him. Well, he's being operated as a marionette by forces that are behind the scenes, right? Telling him how he's gonna be the free leader of the entire world, right? They dictate how that happens. But we need to dictate how our lives look, and that's us rising up. Not easy to do. It's not easy to get people to take risks, but I do think some of us have to realize that you have to take risks. You have to make change. You have to rise up. And we've seen it all over the world. I use Egypt as my model. I use in Chile in 2019, I still have a drone shot that I'm inspired by. Every time I feel downtrodden, I pull out this drone shot of 1.2 million people in the squares of Chile saying, we've had enough. We've had enough. So it's, I hope I'm not promoting violence here. I want to be careful about that. But I think when people have a fill level, it boils over. What is our fill level here is the question that I ask. When are we going to say enough is enough instead of sitting back and say they'll fix it? Well, they broke it. Why? They don't have any intention to fix it. right? So I think there are a lot of questions we have to answer as a housing movement here in the U.S. And then again, I open it up to the international community where we can learn from them, because I've seen struggles in other communities across the globe pushing back on the system and be successful.
This is really, really interesting, Rob. What is the current battle you're most focused on?
My most focused battle right now is the HUD cuts. So HUD is Housing and Urban Development. We have a situation now, particularly in many cities across the country, but particularly in New York, where rents are just through the roof and people can't afford it. People live off of rental subsidies, Section 8 and some other rental subsidies. National Alliance of HUD Tenants organizes around this. But our government is indiscriminately cutting the staff at HUD and putting some of those resources at risk. So if families have that voucher taken away, where are they going to go, right? We know they can't afford housing. This is why they got the subsidy. But I think it's an opportunity to make a weird collaboration right now, what some people might think weird, because there is something called project-based Section 8 buildings. The entire building is a Section 8 building. So the landlord is realizing money from the government that all of a sudden is going to stop. So he has a vested interest in seeing that those tenants stay in there. So maybe it's time for us to sit down, and not every landlord, you can't do this with every landlord, but we need to say, maybe Mr. Landlord, you have a similar interest to us. We can work together to make this a better situation for everybody. So right now it's focused on the HUD cuts in New York. And then I think the other issue is, we're a sanctuary city in New York, and the migrant and immigrant population. How do we support those folks? And for me, to my astonishment, I've watched different movements across different disciplines come together to support those folks who are fighting against our government trying to send people back to different countries around the world. I think that's problematic, but it is encouraging to see people rise up and support them. And then finally, the Palestinian issue, right? It hits everybody. It hits everybody, especially the young folks. They're asking a lot of questions. I do a lot of support for students in New York City around this particular issue. I've been a police negotiator at school uprisings, and things are just different right now. And I don't know what the answer is, but it's something that's on the front burner that we have to find a solution for.
Our capital city has been overtaken by violent gangs and bloodthirsty criminals, roving mobs of wild youth, drugged out maniacs and homeless people. And we're not going to let it happen anymore. We're not going to take it.
Rob, we're back to the present moment, the fall of 2025. A lot has happened since we last spoke in March, both in the possibility of opportunities to break away from the current trap, and in terms of the escalation that is being launched by the Trump administration against the poor. I would like to say that it's an interesting sequence of events that we've seen, in the sense that the Supreme Court already in 2024, in June 2024, had basically given the possibility to criminalize homelessness with its rulings. Then a year later, Trump passes very strict orders to eliminate vital social services, including health care, public health care, and food stamps, that will increase the possibilities for people to end up in the streets. I would like to ask you a little bit about these current developments. What is it about this administrative order that is so dangerous, and how does it work?
So we know from the first city, one of the first cities we put boots on the ground was the capital of the U.S. in Washington, D.C. And we heard from our allies down there that, yes, he put troops on the ground. He wants to remove homelessness from the street, remove the law and disorder that he claims is on the street, but without alternatives. So obviously, people don't make a choice to sleep on the street. They have no other place to go. So if you're going to put that kind of act forward, then offer opportunities for people to go different places. But what we learned from D.C. is you got move-on orders, you were told to leave, and your belongings were thrown away. So any steps that you might have taken to move forward to advance your struggle, now you're taking a step back because you may have lost identification, you may have lost medicine. So you're only exacerbating an ongoing problem. It's not a solution. It's just hiding the problem from public view, and that's not a solution. You're homeless because you don't have a home. So, Mr. President, tell us how you're going to build homes for people that are in need. That's the current problem that we see across the country, not only in New York City, but clean across the country. And until you come up with solutions on giving people alternatives, then we have a problem. What happened in June 2024 gave municipalities permission to carry out his orders or his thinking. So that was the early stages. This law was passed, or this, the case was found in favor, of the oppressor. And now municipalities got official marching orders or official recommendations to remove homelessness from the streets, right? Move it out of sight, but without any alternatives. And I think that's where the big problem lies.
The Supreme Court granted permission to the Oregon Grant Pass city to criminalize and fine all the camping in the streets, even having a pillow in the streets, or even parking overnight in a park. I wanted to read a passage from Matt Watkins, who wrote on Common Dreams a very good commentary. He says, "This order does not restore order. It reinstates a hierarchy of visibility. It tells those without shelter, treatment, or family that the problem is not what they lack, but that they can still be seen. And in doing so, it signals to the rest of us that our security lies in distance, that the absence of suffering from view is proof that has been addressed. It invites the public to mistake silence for peace, stillness for stability, emptiness for care." Your reaction to these words, Rob, especially given your own experience as a homeless person for a while?
So, as I said earlier in my comments, I don't think anybody living on the street wants to make that choice, but they're left with very little alternatives. The cost of housing has gone through the roof, and pun intended for certain people. It's an expensive proposition. Again, wages, when people are employed, don't rise as fast as the cost of rent. And then on top of that, what we're building is not building for need, we're building luxury housing. And that's not the true need, particularly in our urban centers across the country. The need is for affordable, dignified, sustainable rent housing. When people are rent burdened, and you take a city like where I live in New York, 50% of households are rent burdened, which means 50% or more of their income goes towards the cost of housing. The government's own standard is 30%. So it speaks to how big this problem is. But I think there is no humanity within government, particularly this current administration. And what they're attempting to do is reward those cities that carry out his marching orders and take away from the cities that resist the way he's acting, right? So I'll stop your funding New York City or LA or Chicago if you don't follow my lead and work with the people that are coming in, whether it be, troops on the ground, whether it be ICE, whatever methodologies we're going to employ in your city to clean up this problem. If you don't work with them, then I'm going to restrict you from funding, any government funding wherever I can. And I'm going to send that funding to the cities that cooperate with me and carry out my marching orders. And I think that doesn't speak to democracy. That speaks to dictatorship.
The reality the administration wants to hide is that the people who are being cleaned up are actually workers who get up and wear suits and ties to go to work in the morning, but don't have enough to afford to live. So, Rob. That's the piece that's being severely overlooked here, right? Right? It's everyday Americans that just can't afford the prices of food, can't afford the price of medicine, let alone the price of housing. So what are they left to do? Sleep rough, right? But if I sleep rough because I have no alternative, then I face prosecution and criminalization. It just doesn't make sense. The fact that the systemic causes that are being hidden in a very intelligent way, not just by those in the administration right now, but by whole bunch of scientific literature that focus on methodological individualism and refuses to look at the realities of capitalism, people are not buying this anymore. And I would love for you to get into a little bit about what's happening in New York, if there's ferment, if there is excitement about the Zoran campaign, and what are the projects that the housing movements have been working on for a possible better future.
So there is huge excitement, right? This is a huge shift in New York City. And you know it's huge because the minute he won that Democratic primary, the president started shouting nasty words against him. What he's going to do to New York if he wins the mayoral race, what's going to happen. There's a general fear of what socialism means, but there's also a fear, and even with some residents in New York, about the difference. They don't understand the difference between socialism and capitalism. They conflate the two. So I think there's excitement amongst the younger population, and I think that's the wave that got him to win this campaign. And you saw the other candidates, right, start the name calling, following up with the president, trying their best. But the chasm is so large between the polls come out and where he stands within the polls and where the other candidates are, that he's the likely winner. Now, with respect to housing, it's been interesting. He talks a lot about affordability. If you would ask me, it's more than affordability, or I would say, what does that mean? He hasn't been in New York City as a mayor. He's new to this, and that shouldn't be a strike against him, but he should be smart enough to open up the gates and say, housing movement, I need your help here. Help me through this. And that's what a lot of us are looking to do. How do we sit down with Zoran and say, listen, there is a huge problem. We're here to support you. We rode your wave, into this election. You're a different voice, and we want to work with you. And I think that's where the movement has to step up. The movement can't be fantasizing about just having a place at the table. No, your voice has to mean something. You have to be able to organize yourselves and insert your voice into the conversation. And I think something that's interesting that's going to happen in New York is the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Adequate Housing is going to give a report to the General Assembly on October 17th. And his report is going to be on the criminalization of the homeless, worldwide. But the night before, he will be at the New School, a featured speaker and a talk around the criminalization of the homeless. So for me, I've challenged our housing activists, organizers, advocates in New York to say, this is your opportunity, folks. You're in a room with the UN Special Rapporteur, and he's telling you these things that mean something, and now we need to take this in front of Mamdani and say, we want to support you, we want to help you. It's not easy here in New York. We need you to collaborate with us. So I think it's an opportunity not to fantasize about being in a room with them, but to sit down and put some real work together to make social change.
What's the most exciting of the proposals for change of the housing movements in New York?
So I think there's a big push. It's an uphill battle, but to remove land from market speculation. I think our movements understand that now, where they once didn't. 10 years ago, you go into a community and you start talking about land speculation and capitalism. Me as an organizer, I was chased out of many of those communities. Or when I would bring in the teachings of a Richard Wolff or David Harvey, people would say to me, translate this, Rob, I don't understand it. But I see now that people are starting to want more. They're salivating. They understand it. So there's the New York Community Land Initiative where folks are coming together and realizing that public land belongs to the people. How do we take control of that land? How do we push our government to give us that land in perpetuity so that we can start building cooperative housing or mutual housing on top of that land that stays truly affordable? So there's a shift. 10 years ago, I would give the argument that when people said we have a right to housing, that it was just a slogan. But now you see people trying to understand what it means and the 7 core principles of a right to housing. I feel good now. Once upon a time, I used to say, I feel alone on this island. I'm talking about human right and the human right to housing, but I was like the only one. But now it's kind of nice to be able to stand back and hear other people say it and talk about the 7 components of a right to housing without me having to go into a room and say, here's the 7 steps. I want you, so folks are doing their own research, and I think that's powerful. There is a connection that didn't exist in the past, and that connection is between theory and practice. I think people are understanding now that this is the way it has to move forward. Theory and practice have to come together, right? And, not one side. The theoretical isn't a reality. The practical, where we want to go, isn't a reality. How do these two come together to build an analysis of how we want to move forward? And I think if Mamdani wins, we have the best opportunity that we've had in years to move in a different direction in New York City. So I think there's a lot of excitement within communities. There's some tension. I was on a conversation earlier this week where people are afraid that he's so young, he doesn't have experience. Well, the experienced people we have, one dropped out, and he didn't seem to do much. That's Eric Adams. And then we have Cuomo, who, is the best candidate in the world, right? He's got some problems, right, that seem to follow him. Is that who you want back in office, a person like that? So I think people are starting to pull back the curtain and really think outside of the box.
It's clear that the academic discourse and much of even still the media discourse that is focused on the fact that the problem is a lack of supply of housing, and thus we need more private-public partnerships to incentivize private investors. We need tax breaks to incentivize private investors. That narrative is no longer appealing to people. That is understood. Right. That it's just a way for our governing institutions to channel resources towards the usual ones who are speculating off of people's livelihoods.
So I totally agree with you. As I said, I teach a course at the New School in Urbanism. And about 3 weeks ago, I was blessed to have an organizer and a communications person who's attached to the platform of people affected by mortgages in Spain visit the class. At the same time, a researcher, a professor of urban planning from the University of Sao Paulo in Brazil. The other side of the room, we had 2 representatives of a public housing project struggle that we're going through in New York called the Fulton Elliott Chelsea struggle, where the government is trying to bring in a public-private partnership to really recreate that public housing. And the conversation was incredible. And I sat back and I said, it's nice to see the international perspective in a room with the US and people really engaging in critical thinking. And it ended up where they were saying that the people in the public housing unit are going to be evicted if they don't leave. They're starting to get eviction notices if they don't leave in a certain period of time. The representative from Barcelona said, did you guys ever think about squatting? And they're like, what? Yeah, squatting, right? Not leaving, right? Staying in your apartment. So the representatives from the Fulton Chelsea houses said, well, we never did anything like that. So the representative from PAR responds by saying, we have a manual we can send to Rob and Rob can distribute to you. So it was just the incredible cross dialogue of 2 different cultures coming together to solve a problem or to push back on a problem in an unusual way, or it's not so unusual to some of us, but it was unusual to those residents who figured you had to abide by law. Well, you know what? It was great to have the professor from Sao Paulo. And I would say, well, I've been to Sao Paulo many times, and I see banners hanging out of multi-story buildings where the movement had taken over these empty buildings. Right? So we have to get a little more creative here in New York City in the U.S. And it was just, I'm telling you, it was the most incredible conversation. I just sat back smiling and like, okay, this is what I always hope for, right? So I think making these connections is incredible. So people are self-determined, Clara, right? People have the solutions to their own problems. Government can't solve problems because they never experienced it, right? And my mentor imparted words on me years ago, Neil Smith, always said to me when he asked me to lecture his PhD students, and I said, I have an undergraduate degree. And he says, you have an experience that I never had. I can't teach my students what you can. You have knowledge that if you're willing to share, you're a teacher. You don't need a piece of paper to prove you're a teacher. but you can make change by just sharing your own experience. So it was from that point on that, I tried to encourage, and I found myself 20 years later talking about my experience of being homeless. I'm not shamed by it. It's history. I can't change history, right? So what did we learn? What did I learn from that? And whatever I learned, I'm willing to share with others.
Can I end our conversation with one personal note to ask you,
Sure.
what gave you the strength to get out of such a difficult condition when you were in a shelter in New York City and still fighting homelessness?
So let me explain something, because a lot of people look at me with cross eyes when I tell them. So you know me well. You know I have a disability in my hip, and that came from playing football. I went to the University of Maryland on a football scholarship, injured my hip. So at heart, I'm an athlete. And I felt that I'm the first generation in my family to graduate high school and go to a university. And growing up, often there were problems in the house. And my dad, who wasn't highly educated, or neither was my mom, my dad would always say, you figure the dad is the big figure in the household. So you go to dad with a problem. Dad would send my mom or my brothers and sisters to me to get the answer. Your brother is a smart one, or your son is a smart one. Go ask your son. So while I was homeless on the streets of Miami, I never told my family while I was down there. 2.5 years, I never told my family I was homeless. And my whole thought process was, I'm going to figure this out. I had to figure everything out in life. So it kind of drove me. I hate to lose, Clara. And if I stay here, I'm losing, right? So how do I get out of this? And I was fortunate enough to do it. There's something inside of me that drove me to say you got to win. But I think a big part of it, I like to call the transformation of Rob Robinson. So you're taught certain things the first part of your life, a set of values, whether it's from family, friends, etc. You learn things in school. And then for my 2.5 years on the streets of Miami, I'm like, okay, well, that's not the way it was taught to me. Why is this happening to me? So I had a lot of time to think. And then there was a point in Miami when I would go to sleep on the beach. I'd take a bus to Miami Beach where I slept. I would panhandle in downtown Miami, and I would take a bus to go to Miami Beach where I slept. And I go over what was called the I-395 bridge, and I'd see these big structures going up, these luxury structures. And there were banners on them that would say, coming soon, luxury condos, studios starting at $875,000, 1 to 2 bedrooms, $1.5 million. Over a period of time, the bunting changed. For lease, studios, condominiums, 1.5 bedroom, 1 to 2 bedrooms. Sign a 2-year lease, get 2 months rent free. And I'm scratching my head. So I kept hearing this term gentrification while I was homeless. I'm like, what does that mean? So I started going to the library before I would start my day panhandling. And I learned that what this process of gentrification was, how it was playing out. I found my way back to New York City. And the 10 months I was in the shelter, I would go to the library every afternoon and study gentrification here, because the same thing was happening here. And I started asking a bunch of questions. So I sort of self-educated myself on these issues. And that really drove me, because I saw what was happening. I also saw, and probably this more directly answers your question, of people typecasting who you were as a homeless individual. You're homeless because you don't want to work. You're homeless because you don't have an education. You're homeless because you have a chemical or an alcohol addiction. You're homeless because you have mental illness. I started working with my dad when I was 9 years old. I have an undergraduate degree from the University of Miami. I was never diagnosed with a chemical or alcohol addiction, and never diagnosed with mental illness. And that's no reason for us to typecast a person. We should offer help to people like that. So that bothered me. That really drove me. I'm like, I'm going to change this narrative. I'm going to be up front and in front of people and make them scratch their heads every time I get up on the stage and say, yeah, I was formerly homeless. I like for them to look at me from a side angle and really scratch their head. So that's kind of what drove me, right? The fact that these narratives were out there and people were painting the issue with what I like to call a broad brush, right? And the very first talk I did at the City University of New York Graduate Center, I used this expression, painting the issue with a broad brush. And I looked at the audience, there was about 200 people in the room, and I go, you're not going to touch me with that effing brush. And you could hear this gasp in the room. The whole room gasped. But I think people got it from that point. I think they really understood the way I expressed it that afternoon. So that's kind of what drove me. And I think I have an obligation, Clara, to stay in front of other homeless folks and show them that your life can change if you don't drown in your tears and you confront the issue and you push back on the system that's pushing down on you.
So your experience is so important in terms of showing how not only one can make it through the roughness, but also propose different ways of understanding our conditions as humans, really.
Absolutely. I really appreciate it. It is people like yourself, the being able to connect geography, anthropology, and economics together. One of my people that I've always studied and learned from was Dr. Peter Marcuse, an urban planner, who once said of me, Rob has a foot in the community, a foot in academia, a foot in policy, and a foot in government. He has 4 foots, and he's successful at what he does. I don't know how he does it because I thought people only had 2 foots. So I've always loved that expression. Peter was another one, but not everybody was fortunate to be surrounded, Clara, by people like that, like yourself, the Richard Wolves, the David Harveys. I had access to these folks who helped me shape my thinking this part of my life. And they didn't tell me how to think. They came into the room and said, share your story and let's figure out how this happened, right? And that was incredible. They gave me books to read and said, come back when you finish reading this and let's discuss it. Nobody was forcing theory on me. They just said, read this and let's discuss it. And let's see if your experience goes through this narrative that you read about in the book. So having that kind of access and understand, not being intimidated by academics, I think was a big part of it. I think we suffer a lot of in our movements from people who are intimidated by academia, and for some good reasons. Not everybody's a Clara Mattei, not everybody's a Richard Wolff, not everybody's a David Harvey who embraces these interactions with people from the community. It doesn't always happen like that, but the experience can really change our contextual analysis. And I just, I've been blessed to have access to people like that and to help me shape my thinking at this point.
Rob, we are so grateful for your time with us and also your patience with our technological problems. And we really hope to see you very soon again here in Tulsa to meet our community and to join our assembly at the Forum for Real Economic Emancipation. It's such a pleasure. Have a wonderful evening there in New York City.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thanks for having me.